Good afternoon, class. My name is Mariam. I'll continue from our last class. I'm taking you anatomy and physiology of the respiratory system. And from our last class, basically we've only been talking about the anatomy of the respiratory system, and we've not discussed the physiology of respiratory system. Because basically when you're talking about anatomy and physiology, anatomy is more of the structure and physiology is more of the function. And basically since the beginning of our classes, which I apologize has not been consistent, we've only been talking about the anatomy. So today we are going to start discussing about the physiology of the respiratory system. So basically we are going to discuss pulmonary ventilation today. Then we'll go on to talk about the lung volumes and capacity. If time permits, we'll talk about transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Then we'll go ahead to discuss control and regulation of respiration. Then I think we'll just be left with few things to brush off, and we'll call it a day with discuss by the special grace of God, inshallah. So the pulmonary ventilation, as we've discussed the respiratory system, we said the respiratory system, basically the function of the respiratory system cannot be overemphasized because it plays a role in exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the atmospheric air, the blood, and the tissue cells. And this has to do with so many functions that can help. Then also has to do with some mechanism it takes for this exchange to occur. You go to the market, you give money, you take commodities, you go home. It has to do with your efforts of going out, you getting the money, and all these things. So pulmonary ventilation, basically air moves into the lungs when the air pressure inside the lungs is less than the air pressure in the atmosphere. If we can still remember our basic chemistry, atmospheric air diffusion, movement of molecules from region of lower concentration to higher concentration. So this is something that is also constant during respiration. So for air to move into the lung, the air pressure of the lung should be less than the air pressure in the atmosphere. Then when air is about to move out of the lung, the air pressure inside the lung has to be greater than the air pressure in the atmosphere. And this involves basically two steps. We have inhalation, which is air moving in. Then we have exhalation. So when you are talking about inhalation, another name is inspiration, as we know. And just before each inhalation, as I've said, the air pressure inside the lungs is equal to the air pressure of the atmosphere, which at sea level is about 760 millimeter per mercury. So for air to flow into the lungs, the pressure inside the alveoli must become lower than the atmospheric pressure. That is the diffusion. So this condition is usually achieved by increasing the size of the lung, that's inflation of the lungs. So for this inhalation to occur, the lungs must expand just to accommodate enough oxygen, which increases the lung volume and thus decreases the pressure in the lungs to below atmospheric pressure. So as the air is moving in, it is also decreasing the atmospheric pressure. And we know that the most important muscle of inhalation is the diaphragm. That is the most important muscle. So this increases also the vertical diameter of the thoracic cavity, and contraction of the diaphragm is also responsible for about 75% of the air that enters the lungs during quiet breathing. And as a result, there is an increase in the anterior, posterior, and lateral diameters of the chest cavity. Then we also have exhalation now, which is the total opposite of what is happening, and it is also called expiration, which is also due to pressure difference. These are things that occur because of pressure difference. So during exhalation, the pressure in the lungs is greater than the pressure of the atmosphere. Normal exhalation is usually a passive process because there's no muscular contraction, unlike inhalation, which is an active process because there is muscular contraction. So instead, the exhalation usually results from elastic recoil of the fibers of the chest wall and lungs, both of which have natural tendency to spring back after they have been stretched. Exhalation usually starts when the inspiratory muscles relaxes. So immediately when they relax, the diaphragm relaxes and its dome move superiorly owing to its elasticity. So as the external intercostal muscle relax, the ribs usually become depressed too. So this movement now decreases the vertical, lateral, and the anterior posterior diameters of the thoracic cavity, which is now decreasing the lung volume. So in turn, the alveoli pressure increases to about 762. If you can remember from beginning, I told you it is about 760 millimeter per mercury, but now it decreases it to 762. Then air flows from the area of higher pressure to area of lower pressure in the atmosphere. I told you for exhalation, the pressure in the lungs is greater than the pressure outside. But for inhalation, the pressure in the atmosphere is higher and the pressure in the lungs is lower. So that is that for inhalation and exhalation. So we now have lung volumes and capacities. What are these terms? What are these? Just like you have in cardiovascular system, you have terms like cardiac output, stroke volume, all these things. In respiratory system, it also has its own. While at rest, an average adult, as we all know, breathes average of 12 breaths a minute, and the apparatus we use to measure the volume of air exchanged and expiratory rate is called a spirometer or respirometer, and the record, that is the measure gotten, is called a spirogram. So the first one here we have is tidal volume, and tidal volume is the volume of air that moves in and comes out with each inhalation and exhalation. The volume of air that moves in and comes out, just like we have cardiac output, the total amount of blood in the cardiovascular system, just like we have when you're talking about stroke volume is just restricted to one chamber. Then cardiac output has to do with the amount of blood that the heart pumps out every minute. That is how we have for tidal volume also. So it is the volume of air that moves in and comes out with each inhalation and exhalation, and it is approximately, for a healthy adult, it is approximately 500 ml. Then we have inspiratory reserve volume. From the name, inspiratory reserve volume, this is the additional amount of air other than 500 ml that can be inhaled with a deep breath. Mostly you get the inspiratory reserve volume when the person deeply breathes. So the other extra, apart from the 500 ml, any other thing apart from that 500 ml is your inspiratory. When you breathe in, inspiratory, that means you are breathing in, then reserve volume. Then we have, and it is approximately 3,100 in male in males, then 1,900 in females. Then we have expiratory reserve volume. Now this is the volume of air in addition of 500 ml that can be expelled out by a forceful exhalation after a normal inhalation. So you take key of the points there. After a normal inspiration. So we have the inspiratory capacity, which I said is the sum of the tidal volume and the inspiratory reserve volume. That is for inspiratory capacity. So instead of saying expiratory capacity volume, we now say functional residual volume. But this one now is the sum of residual volume and expiratory reserve volume. If you remember, I said residual volume, even after the strong exhalation, we still have some little amount of air that is still left inside the lungs, and this is not something you can measure with the spirometer. So when you add that to your expiratory reserve volume, that is the volume of air in addition to that 500 ml that can be expelled out by a forceful expiration after a normal inhalation. That will give you the functional residual volume. Then we have vital capacity. Now this is addition of 1 to 1 to 1. That is addition of inspiratory reserve volume to tidal volume to expiratory reserve volume. Now we have three components to give you vital capacity. Then we have total lung capacity. This is addition of everything I've mentioned. That is the sum of vital capacity. Vital capacity, I said, is addition of inspiratory reserve volume, tidal volume, and expiratory reserve volume plus residual volume. So you can see basically everything I've mentioned. When you want to check for total lung capacity, that is when you get that. Then another thing I want us to talk about is the external and internal respiration. How is this change of pressure between environment, the tissue, and the lungs? We have basically two components: the external respiration or the pulmonary gas exchange. Then we have the internal respiration or systemic gas exchange. That is exchange of gases between the body and systemic capacity in capillary, sorry. Then we have the external respiration or pulmonary, that is between the atmosphere and the lungs. So the external respiration or pulmonary gas exchange is the diffusion of oxygen from alveoli of the lungs to blood in pulmonary capillaries, and the diffusion of carbon dioxide in the opposite direction, that is from blood in pulmonary capillaries to alveoli of lungs. So external respiration is responsible for conversion of the oxygenated blood into oxygenated blood in the lungs. We know that is basically the function of pulmonary gas exchange. So as this blood flows through the pulmonary capillaries, it picks up this oxygen from the lungs and offloads the carbon dioxide into the lungs. So this exchange of gas usually depends upon the partial pressure, like I've told you from the beginning. It is when there is change in pressure that is what prompts the whole system to be activated, and this exchange of either gases between either the body, the capillaries and tissues, or the lungs and the atmosphere. So this gas usually they move from areas of higher partial pressure to area where its partial pressure is low. So in a resting person, the partial pressure of oxygen alveoli of lung is usually 105 millimeter per mercury, whereas the partial pressure in pulmonary capillary is usually 40 millimeter per mercury. So you can see if you have 105 in the lungs and in the pulmonary capillaries it is 40 milligram, you should expect that this oxygen will move from area of that lung down to the pulmonary capillaries. So that is how the oxygen diffuses from area of higher concentration to area of lower concentration, which is basically the meaning of diffusion. So then that is basically the external respiration. Then for the internal respiration or the systemic gas exchange, usually the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between systemic capillaries and tissue cells. So as this oxygen is leaving the bloodstream, oxygenated blood is converted into deoxygenated blood. Unlike external respiration, where I told you it occurs in the lungs, internal respiration occurs in the tissue throughout the body. That is why it is called systemic. This is something that runs throughout the body. And the partial pressure of blood in systemic capillaries is usually higher. That is 100 millimeter per mercury than the partial pressure in tissue cells, which is 40 millimeter per mercury. So because of this pressure difference, oxygen diffuses out of the capillaries into the tissue cells, and blood partial pressure of oxygen drops to 400 millimeter. So while oxygen diffuses from systemic capillaries into the tissue cells, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide of cells usually higher than that of systemic capillary blood. So as a result, carbon dioxide usually diffuses from tissue cells into systemic capillaries until the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood increases to 45 millimeter per mercury. So this deoxygenated blood then returns to the heart and is pumped to the lungs for another cycle of external respiration, because the heart is the one that is connecting the whole systemic circulation with the lungs. Then we have transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. This is basically how blood is transported, and the blood transport gas between the lungs and body tissues. We have components of the blood that helps in transporting this kind of components. How many minutes? So the blood transport gases between the lungs and body tissues. So when oxygen and carbon dioxide enter the blood, certain chemical reactions occur that aid in gas transport and gas exchange. What are these chemical reactions? Now the first thing is obviously the oxygen transport. Then we have the partial pressure of oxygen. Acidity also contributes. Partial pressure of carbon dioxide. All these things are things that are put into consideration. Then the temperature also, the carbon dioxide transport. Then we have the carbamino compound, which is also responsible for transport to start. So the oxygen transport, oxygen usually transported to tissue by blood, by dissolving in blood plasma, and by binding with that component of the blood that carries the oxygen, which is called hemoglobin, and is present only in the red blood cell. So the hem portion of this hemoglobin usually contains 4 atoms of iron. So each of these atoms usually capable of binding to 1 molecule of oxygen. So if the 4 will bind to a molecule of oxygen, that is 4 molecules of oxygen. The formula is there, it should be ready in your notes. So oxygen and hemoglobin bind in an easily form, and when they bind, the name changes to oxyhemoglobin. So this oxygen that binds to the hemoglobin in pulmonary capillaries to form oxyhemoglobin, then they dissociate into the tissue capillaries into oxygen and hemoglobin and go their separate ways. They divorce each other. So this binding and dissociation of this usually depends on several factors, which we've said. That is, the first one is the partial pressure of oxygen. And the most important factor that determines binding and dissociation of oxygen with hemoglobin is the partial pressure of oxygen. So the higher the partial pressure of oxygen, the more oxygen combines with hemoglobin. So if the partial pressure is higher in pulmonary capillaries, therefore binding of oxygen and Hb, that is hemoglobin, will take place in pulmonary capillaries. And if the partial pressure of oxygen is lower in tissue capillaries, therefore oxyhemoglobin will dissociate. And that is why God made it wonderful that it is only higher in pulmonary capillaries, but when it comes to the tissue level, it is lower so that it can dissociate. But at that other level, the pulmonary capillaries, it can bind because that is the only place it can pick up the oxygen. Then when it gets to the tissue level, it dissociates so that the body can use it. Then we also have acidity. As acidity increases, of course, when acidity increases, the pH is supposed to decrease. So the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen usually decreases. Affinity, likeness, and oxygen dissociates more readily from hemoglobin. In other words, increasing acidity enhances the unloading of oxygen from hemoglobin. So the main acids produced by metabolically active tissues, usually the lactic acid and carbonic acid, which causes decrease in pH in tissue cells. So as a result, the oxyhemoglobin present in tissue capillary usually dissociates into oxygen and hemoglobin. Then also, we also have the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. We've talked about the partial pressure of oxygen, and I told you the higher the area where the partial pressure is, the more easily the oxygen and hemoglobin binds. And the area where the partial pressure is decreased, that is where it dissociates. And it is higher in the pulmonary capillaries and lower in the tissue. Then that's for carbon dioxide also. Carbon dioxide also can bind to hemoglobin. And as partial pressure of carbon dioxide rises, hemoglobin releases oxygen more readily. So partial pressure of carbon dioxide is usually higher in tissue cells and lower in alveoli. Unlike for oxygen, it is higher in alveoli and lower in tissue cells. But this one is higher in tissue cells and lower in alveoli. So as oxygen and hemoglobin is dissociating, it is now picking up carbon dioxide. So you can see the exchange that is happening between these two areas. Partial pressure of carbon dioxide and the pH are usually related factors because low blood pH, that is acidity, usually result from high partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So because this carbon dioxide enters into the blood, it is temporarily converted to carbonic acid by an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. So we have the carbon dioxide, which includes water, turns to carbonic acid to give us hemoglobin, hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ion. So this carbonic acid that is formed in red blood cells usually dissociates into hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. And as the hydrogen concentration increases, the pH is decreasing. And if the pH is decreasing, you should know that the acidity is increasing. Thus, an increased partial pressure of carbon dioxide usually produces more acidic environment because it is decreasing the pH, and this helps the release of oxygen from hemoglobin to dissociate at the tissue level so that it can pick up the carbon dioxide. And during exercise, for example, during exercise, lactic acid, which we have said is a byproduct of anaerobic metabolism within muscles, this is something that also decreases the blood pH. Then we also have temperature, which is another factor that should be considered within limits, that is within normal limits. Increase in temperature usually increases the amount of oxygen, which is released from hemoglobin. Heat, which is also a byproduct of metabolic reaction of all cells, and the heat release is usually by contracting muscle fibers, which tends to raise body temperature. Metabolically active cells require more oxygen and liberate more acid and heat. The acid and heat in turn promote release of oxygen from oxyhemoglobin. So fever is something that produces a similar rest, because you know when there is fever, the internal temperature, the temperature, we have surface temperature, we have core temperature. So when the core temperature increases, it is something that usually liberates more acids. So this is something that promotes release of oxygen, and that is what causes that tachypnea during fever. Then we have BPG, which is biphosphoglycerates, and this is a substance that is found in the red blood cell. And this substance decreases the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen and helps unload oxygen from hemoglobin. So when you combine BPG, that is biphosphoglycerate, with hemoglobin, the hemoglobin binds oxygen less tightly. So the greater the level of BPG, the more oxygen is unloaded from the hemoglobin. Then we also have the carbon dioxide transport. Apart from the oxygen transport, we also have carbon dioxide, because as oxygen is transported in, carbon dioxide needs to move out, because it is that oxygen that is converted to carbon dioxide, and it needs to move out. So carbon dioxide is transported from tissue cells to lungs by following methods. We have dissolved carbon dioxide. So about 7% of this carbon dioxide is dissolved in blood plasma. So upon reaching the lungs, it diffuses into alveolar air and is exhaled. Then carbamino compounds. So this carbamino compound is something that is produced from the combination of hemoglobin and carbon dioxide. When you have combination of this hemoglobin and carbon dioxide, it gives carbamino hemoglobin. So the formation of this is usually also greatly influenced by the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So for example, in tissue capillaries that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is relatively high, it promotes formation of carbamino hemoglobin. But in pulmonary capillaries, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is low. It is only higher in tissue cells. And the carbon dioxide readily splits apart from globin and enters into the alveoli. Then we have the bicarbonate ions, and about 70% of carbon dioxide is transported in blood plasma as bicarbonate ions. And as carbon dioxide enters red blood cell, it reacts with water, and in the presence of the enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, and to form carbonic acid, which dissociates into hydrogen ion and bicarbonates. So as blood passes through the pulmonary capillaries in the lung, all these reactions reverse and carbon dioxide is exhaled. So there's a diagram clear for you there that will describe all the English I've been speaking. I pray it summarizes everything for you. We have the transport of oxygen there. As oxygen is moving, the partial pressure of oxygen usually higher in the tissue than that in the pulmonary alveoli. But that of carbon dioxide is quite opposite. So as one is having affinity for a particular area, one is having low affinity for that area, having more affinity for another area. And we talked about how temperature, BPG, and things like acidity can affect transport of these gases. Partial pressure, when there's change in partial pressure, it is something that triggers the movement of this, either the oxygen or the carbon dioxide. For carbon dioxide, the partial pressure is usually higher in the pulmonary alveoli. So it moves from the tissue cells, binds to the hemoglobin, becomes what we call the carbamino acid, and moves there, then dissociates to form by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, and from there it moves out. Then we also have the oxygen, which moves in, combines with the hemoglobin to form oxyhemoglobin. Then when it gets to the tissue level, it dissociates because the partial pressure in the tissue cells is usually lower. Basically, that is the whole idea behind the transport of oxygen in and out of the lungs. So before we meet in our next class, I also want us to go over what we've discussed today. Basically, this is the whole physiology behind movement of oxygen and out. And as I've told you in one of my classes, this is something you have to understand for you to be properly able to understand the disorders of the respiratory system, because mostly it is one at a point of exchange of these things, when it is interrupted, that causes most times the problem. So it is basically very important that we understand, and as we are preparing for our exams also, these are basically things you can come across in your multiple choice questions, and it shouldn't be confusing to you. It's just basic chemistry, and now in addition with the body system, which will help us to understand the whole concept behind the respiratory system. And I know right now you already have the anatomy at the tip of your hands, and I'm hoping that you also have the physiology at the tip of your hands. So we are going to stop here for today. If you have any questions, you can drop them via your WhatsApp group chat. I'll be there to respond by God's grace. Thank you for listening.